Welcome back to our conversation marking the second year of the war in Ukraine. We've just finished a terrific conversation about whether it was an inflection point when Russia invaded Ukraine 2 years ago. And we're now going to focus on questions of leadership and the difference leadership has made in this conflict, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Not necessarily in that order. We're going to be looking at Vladimir Putin, President Biden, and Volodymyr Zelensky, but also at other leaders around the world and how they have seized on this as an opportunity or walked away from this as an opportunity to lead in the international system as well as at home. Together, how have these leaders defined the trajectory of the war, and how have they thought about politics within their own countries, as well as the world order? Conclusions about presidential leadership and decision-making in the 21st century are really important. They set a standard that other countries pay attention to and will have big implications, particularly as elections happen in the United States and in Russia later this year. For this panel, our special guest is Tom Graham, a distinguished fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Tom was senior director for Russia on the National Security Council staff in the Bush 43 administration, during which he managed the White House-Kremlin strategic dialogue. He was a career Foreign Service officer for 14 years, including 2 tours of duty at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. And he's also served at the State Department policy planning staff. It's becoming a recurring theme, and on the staff of the Defense Department's Undersecretary for Policy. Tom's immediate respondents will be 2 distinguished UVA and Miller Center faculty members who I will introduce more fully in a bit, Alan Stam and Mark Silverstone. And then once again, I will introduce our other panelists as we go through the conversation, and we'll take questions from the audience. For those here in person, please again use the cards at your seats. For those online, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So Tom, let's get started. Your recent book, Getting Russia Right, is a tour de force. You make a number of arguments about how the West has sized up Russia, including how we've gotten Russia wrong, going back to the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War, and the return to great power competition. You argue that we did get Russia wrong in a number of key regards, but beyond that, you also say that we got Putin wrong and that Putin himself has made a number of mistakes. You give a very compelling analysis of the broad institutions and norms within which Putin operates in Russia, and we'll want you to talk about that. And then you discuss how he calculated and miscalculated in his invasion of Ukraine. So help us understand, is this a war we invited Russia to begin? Is this Putin's war? Is it Russia's war? And what did Putin's leadership style contribute to the conflict? Good, bad, and ugly.
Great, thank you very much, Bill, and it is a real pleasure to be here with this distinguished audience, and it's particularly good to be here with Eric Edelman, who is going to correct everything that I have to say about Russia in the next few minutes. Let me start with a fundamental point, and that is that it is almost impossible to exaggerate the role that Ukraine plays in the Russian imagination. It is the origins of its statehood, the cradle of its civilization. It's been an important buffer zone throughout history, an important source of Russian military power in both the late Tsarist period, clearly into the Soviet period as well. Any Russian leader would have been concerned about what was happening in Ukraine over the past several years, particularly this clear movement of Ukraine away from Russia's orbit into the Euro-Atlantic community. But not every Russian leader would have chosen to go to war to stop that, and Putin did. And I think there are at least 3 personal attributes that help us understand that decision. First is plain hubris. Putin had very little respect for Western leaders in February of 2024. That included President Biden. They looked at the chaotic exit from Afghanistan and made certain conclusions about what the United States would do in response to any military action by Russia. They had less respect for other Western leaders in Europe, and almost no respect for the Ukrainian leadership at that point, particularly Volodymyr Zelensky, whose popularity was probably in the low 20s at that time. Second was that I think we've seen over the past several years a shift in the way Putin himself analyzes foreign policy. If you looked at his very initial years in power, he was very pragmatic. He would calculate balances of power, didn't run undue risks. Over the past 5 years, something that was exacerbated by his extreme isolation during the pandemic, is you've seen the growth of a messianic element in his thinking. He compares himself to Peter the Great, other great Russian czars, and what did great Russian czars do? They all expanded the empire. They gathered Russian lands together, and there was no part of Russia and the Russian inheritance that was more important than Ukraine from that standpoint. You've also seen Putin in more recently pose as this great leader of a anti-Western, anti-colonial movement. If we think of the conflict in terms of democracy versus autocracy, for Putin and Russian, right, it's the West versus the non-West, the world majority, and Putin sees himself as a major player in both bringing that world majority together and leading it. And then the final element that is important here on the personal side is that by moving into Ukraine, bringing it back into the Russian orbit, Putin had a chance to erase the blemishes on his own record in Ukraine. Remember back in 2004, he supported a presidential candidate who ended up on the losing side during the Orange Revolution. Even in 2014, I think Putin was undone in his own mind by the failure of the then Russian Ukrainian president, Viktor Yanukovych, to be able to master this Maidan revolution. Putin wound up seizing Crimea at that point, but that was less than what he had wanted, which was to use Yanukovych as a lever to, in a sense, control the geopolitics of Ukraine as a whole. So those three things, hubris, messianism, and erasing the blemishes, I think played a large role in his decision to invade. Second is that what we have seen over the past several years is a radical narrowing of the circle of advisors around Putin, again, exacerbated by the extreme isolation during the pandemic. And those 3 or 4 people that he relied on, that he saw on a regular basis, in many ways were more antagonistic towards the West than Putin himself was. We can think of the Secretary of the Security Council, Nikolai Patrushev, for example. There was a businessman who was also a major proponent of this great Russia and moving things forward. As I already said, most of the other key people you thought would have been engaged in the decision-making process in Russia were left on the sidelines and in the dark. Foreign ministry in particular. Foreign Minister Lavrov was aware that Russia was going to move militarily into Ukraine about 2 hours before it happened. Other people were simply left out of the loop. Then finally, I think what we've also seen over the past probably decade or more is a lessening of the restraints that other elite actors placed on Putin's ability to make decisions in isolation. This growing sense among much of the elites that without Putin, the system becomes destabilized, their position comes under threat, and therefore they're not willing to push against decisions that are already made as forcefully as they might have earlier in Putin's reign. And so all of those things led or gave Putin himself great latitude to make the decision on his own, and I said his own personal attributes made him quite confident that this was going to be a short, victorious war, and would have enhanced his position as a Russian leader. Now, because he thought it was going to be a short, victorious war, he did nothing to prepare the population as a whole, nor the elites, for this invasion. And that leads to the sort of the second large point that I want to make. And one of the things that Putin is concerned about, I think weighs heavily in his thinking, is popular reaction, popular support. It is, I think, important that from the very beginning, the Kremlin has refused to call this a war. It's a special military operation, which requires, or should require, very little input from the population as a whole. If you look at the way they went about the mobilization in the fall of 2022, it was a partial mobilization. They didn't want a full-scale mobilization because they thought that that would have a very large negative impact on the population as a whole. When they did mobilize, what they did was go after soldiers from the Far East, from the minority republics, those populations that were less likely to protest against conscription, and they basically left alone Moscow, St. Petersburg, the big cities, where they wanted a more tranquil environment. And because popular unrest in Moscow and St. Petersburg carries political consequences that go far beyond what happens in the rest of the country. When it comes to Moscow, what you saw the Kremlin do is crack down very hard on the initial demonstrations against the conflict, to make it clear that this would not be tolerated, and that the Kremlin has gradually over time put in place ever more repressive legislation, have cracked down even harder. They are deeply concerned about the sort of liberal professional class being seen in active protest, and then linking up in some way with some of the other sort of socioeconomic dissatisfaction you see in the country. That is what I think the Kremlin sees as a significant threat to its own position. This is the way the Soviet Union came undone in the late 1980s. This is the way the revolution was launched back in 1917. So very much a focus now on keeping the population, the politically active population, as far removed from the conflict as possible. You go to Moscow today, you see very few signs of war at all. Restaurants are filled, people are out on the streets enjoying themselves. Finally, a couple of other points that you asked me to address. First, on the effectiveness. We saw clearly that this decision-making process was not effective in the initial phase of the conflict. Gross miscalculations, misread the Western unity, misread Ukrainian capabilities, over-exaggerated Russian military capabilities, overestimated the role that Russian energy and European energy dependence on Russia would have as this conflict unfolded. So you saw the gross miscalculation. I think some nervousness in the Kremlin through 2022, particularly in the fall, with successful Ukrainian counteroffensives around Kherson and Kharkiv. But if you look at what has happened over the past several months, actually a great deal of resilience in this system that has led to, I think, confidence at this point in Russian capabilities. We will get a sense of how firmly Putin is in control in the next several weeks, the Russian presidential election. We all know that Putin is going to win. That's not the issue. The question is how he wins, and there will be targets on turnout, targets on percentage of votes that the elite has to deliver, and they need to deliver that with a minimum of blatant fraud. If he can do that, then Putin will have demonstrated his continuing mastery of the political system, and that will filter down through the elites to population as a whole. It will validate what he's been doing in the conflict so far. If, on the other hand, you don't meet those marks where it has to be done with blatant fraud, that sends a signal of political weakness that some people will be able to exploit. Final point, and I'll stop here. If you think of a next leader, we don't know when that's going to happen, but it will eventually. Given sort of the difficulties of consolidating power, given the other sort of domestic and international challenges we face, I don't expect that we're going to get a leader that's more aggressive than Putin at this point. I think you will get a leader who returns to this more traditional way, Russian way of pursuing foreign policy, which is pragmatic, realpolitik, clear calculation, a balance of power, and this will open up an opportunity for, I think, some geopolitical reordering in the priorities that Russia sets for its foreign policy going forward.
Tom, that's really terrific. I'm going to ask one quick follow-up, and then I'll turn to Alan and Mark here. You talked a little bit about President Putin's assessment of Zelensky, that his popularity was not particularly high at the outset of the war. Talk a little bit, if you will, about his assessment of both Biden and Xi. There was a lot of talk that the way the U.S. government handled, for instance, the pullout of Afghanistan might have sent a signal to Putin that Biden was weak and didn't want to pay attention to international affairs. Right before the invasion, they talked about their partnership without limits with President Xi. We've seen some limits in that partnership, and we've seen a fairly robust response from President Biden, even if he's not been able to, as of yet, secure the next round of support for Ukraine. Give us a little bit of a sense of how much Putin is watching these other leaders and assessing that.
Well, he watches the other leaders very, very closely. That's what presidents of Russia do. There was a strange assessment of Biden at that point in September and the fall of 2022. On the one hand, they did see that weakness, the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan. But they also saw something that they thought would be helpful to them, and that was strength, in the sense that Biden went through with the withdrawal from Afghanistan, despite this considerable resistance within the American political establishment, within his own administration, to going down that path as rapidly as he did. And what they concluded from that was that Biden himself would see the impossibility of putting up significant resistance to Russia, moving into Ukraine, and even if there were significant pressure inside the United States to push back against Russia, Biden would demonstrate that strong presidential leadership and not take that action. So I think they misread the president clearly. They misread the American, may not have misread where the American political elite was, but they misread Putin, and that encouraged the move into Ukraine in February. With Xi, look, there's been a close personal bond between these two men that has developed over the past decade. This is the person that the national leader that Putin feels closest to. We don't know exactly what was said in that meeting in February, a few weeks before the invasion, the No Limits partnership. I suspect that Putin wasn't fully open with Xi as to what his intentions were. All that said, the relationship with Xi remains strong, and we've seen that over the past couple of meetings between the two men. That said, my sense is that while Russia is drawing closer to China as a consequence of this collapse of relationship with the West, that the Russians and Putin himself are not fully satisfied with the support that they're getting from China. This isn't like Iran, North Korea, that are providing lethal weapon that is on the battlefield. I think there's a sense in the Kremlin that clearly China does not want Russia to be defeated, and they will provide the type of support that's necessary to prevent that. On the other hand, they're not convinced that China wants Russia to win. And they're not persuaded that China is doing as much as it could to provide investment into the Russian economy that will help it grow over the long run, and not merely take advantage of Russia's straitened circumstances now to get access to natural resources that knock down prices, and to put products into the Russian market where they've been abandoned by the West, cars and smartphones being prime examples.
That's really great. Thank you, Tom. I'm going to turn to Alan Stamm. Alan is University Professor of Public Policy and Politics here at UVA. He's also a Miller Center Faculty Senior Fellow. He's the former Dean of the Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy, and is himself an expert on leadership. He has, of his many books, The Behavioral Origins of War and Why Leaders Fight. So Alan, as you've studied leaders and leadership, as you've taught it and designed curriculum around it, as you've been a leader, your research tells us that leaders' choices are shaped by a myriad of factors. So what are the factors that you're looking at? What are the motivations? What are the constraints? Who do they lead? How do they lead? And what have you learned 2 years into this conflict about the key leaders involved?
Wow, it's a pretty high bar. Thanks for that saucy introduction, Bill. So I'm a political scientist. I'm not a historian, so I don't specialize in a particular country or place, which can be, I tend to think in generalities rather than detailed specifics. And in that way, when we think about leaders and leadership, we sort of think about it in three layers. One would be the one that Mr. Graham has talked about, the personal history and the personal character and attributes of the leader. In that regard, a couple of things in our data analysis of broad data sets of leaders, leader age is something that comes out, and how that interacts in the institutional setting in which they work. Older leaders typically, but not always, tend to be much more experienced. So in the type of decision-making that's taking place with regard to very high-stakes events like this war in Ukraine, experience is something that is, I think, underappreciated by people reading the newspaper, the general public. And so both President Biden and President Putin, at this point, for better or for worse, regardless of one's opinion of their choices, they're very experienced. They've been managing at the highest levels of executive power literally for decades. And we see this in the US presidential setting, that foreign policy decisions made by presidents in their second terms tend to be somewhat qualitatively better than those in their first. The second thing that we look at generally, and that there's an enormous literature in political science on, is the group setting, the small group crisis management setting that these leaders make their decisions in or with the advice of. And one of the critical aspects of those group dynamics is, are they homogeneous in the sense that, the popular characterization would be they're surrounded by yes men. And so in President Putin's case, there's generally a sense that and others will be able to comment better than I, but that he looks for a particular type of person to provide him advice, and it's not somebody that's telling him he's making a huge mistake. In the American setting, clearly President Biden is hearing it from literally all directions, both from within his own advisory group. So, for example, in the State Department with regard to Gaza a couple of weeks ago, there was a letter signed by anonymous staffers deeply criticizing the president's decision. So in the US case here, there's information coming from all different avenues, which can be extraordinarily challenging for the individual having to process this information. It can be difficult, to be incredibly stressful, but at the same time, it tends to help them avoid making blind alleys. The third aspect of the group, though, is the deference to this individual leader. And again, President Putin, there's definitely a sense, at least from the things that we learned at the outset of the war, that he tends to be given more deference than I think we're seeing President Biden receive. I'll get to President Zelensky in just a moment. It's the third aspect. It's the broader institutional setting in which these presidents work that shapes the options that they have, importantly, particularly at the outset of these conflicts, but also the president's expectations of how they're going to be treated after the conflict's over. And so we, as political scientists, we tend to sort of lump things together for categorization purposes, and we think of democracies, oligarchies, and authoritarian or dictatorships. Now, in democratic systems, if a democratic president makes a terrible mistake, essentially the worst punishment they're going to face is being voted out of office. President Biden will have a multi-million-dollar book deal. He'll be able to retire to his beach house in Delaware. Worse things have happened to human beings. One of the things about dictators is that they tend to have consolidated power extraordinarily, and so they're able to also ride out, in different ways, but terrible mistakes. It's the group in the middle, the oligarchs, that oftentimes face brutal punishment for bad mistakes, and particularly for leading their countries into wars whose outcomes, and Mr. Graham addressed this, where the general public views the outcome of the war as a mistake, as a bad outcome, as a failure. In those settings, oligarchic leaders are treated oftentimes either by exile, death, or completely being ostracized by their sort of body politic. Now, from a sort of intellectual academic perspective, what makes this particular situation so interesting is that Russia today is evolving from an oligarchy into a personalist dictatorship. The United States, I may be speaking, some disagree with some of my colleagues, but I think that we're still a fairly stable democracy, current events notwithstanding. Ukraine is transitioning from an oligarchy to a democracy. What we don't know is and I hope some of my colleagues can illuminate this, what would be essentially the post-war treatment that President Putin and President Zelensky might reasonably expect or believe to be facing as they contemplate if there are any negotiated settlements that might be acceptable to them personally, given their personal attributes and the advice that they're getting from their inner circle of advisors. And so, the good news is I think we have a really useful set of tools to help think through the detailed information that our historical colleagues can focus on. The challenge is that many of the things that if we look back in history as canonical examples, the features of those important examples that determined the outcome, the change in leadership, intervention by a third party, those are up in the air, and the domestic political attributes and institutional features are uncertain at the moment, in the sense that they appear to be changing. With regard, and I'll stop here, President Zelensky's inner circle, for example, appeared to, at the beginning of the war, provide him with actually fairly unbiased information. He is taking steps, it appears, in the last week, to make his inner circle more in line with his own personal view of thinking, which increases his comfort level in making decisions, at the same time may reduce the quality of the information that he's presented with. And so I'll stop there and turn it back to you, Bill.
Great, thanks, Alan. A lot to get into there, and I know we're going to want to follow up. Finally, I'll bring in Mark Silverstone before we open it up to the conversation. Mark is the Director of Presidential Studies here. He has for many, many years been the co-director of the Center's Presidential Recordings Program, listening to the secret Oval Office tapes of the Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, and a few other presidents before and since then administration. He's a historian of the Cold War with one book on how the U.S. and Great Britain responded to the rise of communism, and another book on the Kennedy administration's fraught decisions on whether to withdraw or stay in Vietnam before President Kennedy's assassination. Mark has also studied extensively the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis, both of which have echoes in the current conflict, as well as America's two-decade engagement in Afghanistan. So Mark, as you look across all of those big trajectories in the Cold War and a lot of the proxy wars that have defined the relationship between the United States and Russia, the United States and China. What are you seeing in the current moment, particularly in the Biden administration, but also in these other leaders, particularly since politics have changed in Russia and in China over that period of time? But there is a lot of consistency about the kinds of conflicts that we've seen.
Yeah. So I'll say at the outset that I took note during the previous panel of all the times that various people said that they were wrong. And I took some comfort in that as I begin my remarks, especially with members of various administrations in attendance, administrations I'll be talking about. But this issue of the trajectory of presidential leadership as we saw it in the Cold War, in the post-war era more generally, in the post-Cold War period, is fascinating to take a look at in the context of what's happening now in Ukraine, but also to take a look at the trajectory within an administration and how that evolves and what happens from the first year to the second to the third, and in particular, as we have spoken about, this dynamic that we've seen from time to time in which there's an early stumble, a first year, could be early in the first year, could be later in the first year, but then oftentimes a rebound with the administration achieving some measure of success later on. And there's a question of what happens between point A and point B. Did something really take place on the front end in terms of an after-action report, a post-mortem that was done that gave the administration an opportunity to learn from its mistakes and then succeed? And so that's essentially what I'm going to focus on here. In the Biden case, of course, the stumble was clear for all to see. August of 2021, the withdrawal from Afghanistan. The leading narrative that came out of that episode was that this withdrawal hurt both Biden and the country's credibility, as well as its reputation abroad. We've spoken a little bit about that in this panel, as well as the previous one. That was certainly the case with the execution of withdrawal, the sense of competence, ironically, that Joe Biden had campaigned on in 2020 was not in great evidence during those days and weeks at the end of August of 21. But even the fact of withdrawal, I would say, was still a matter of debate for so many, as there were calls for him to revisit the Doha Agreement signed by President Trump in February of 2020, and not just some of its particulars regarding what the Taliban would or would not do, but really the very fact of a United States withdrawal, that it would be possible for the United States to keep any number of advisors there, to make sure that there was still some stability in the country to protect American interests, even recognizing that the reason for going in the first place, the removal of al-Qaeda, had been achieved. I think it's unlikely that Biden would have revisited, given everything that he had said about it for years and years, but there was certainly a narrative out there that he should have done that. Ultimately, what it seems to have done is spooked America's allies and emboldened America's adversaries. At least that's the narrative that came out of that episode. And ultimately, it smoothed the path for Vladimir Putin to wage war on Ukraine. But then, lo and behold, once the war began, 6 months later, after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, we see the reemergence of Biden the competent. I wonder if you could even term him that. Observers certainly criticized the reluctance of the Biden team to speed up the delivery of weapons systems to Ukraine, particularly increasingly sophisticated weapons systems that might have helped them early on in the conflict and certainly later in the conflict, and perhaps even have led to a different situation on the ground than it is today. But be that as it may, he still seemed to show real leadership in terms of his strategic declassification of intelligence, his ability to mobilize an international response, his ability to continue to hold an alliance together, the imposition of economic sanctions, the provision of lethal aid, economic aid, really an extraordinary performance for many, again, in the wake of Afghanistan. So where else have we seen these dynamics? A stumble followed by a success. Is there something that those other episodes can teach us about presidential leadership and perhaps even about the role of credibility and resolve in the way that leaders, as well as their adversaries, think about them. There are lots of cases we can look at. I chose two. Both involve policies actually held over from a prior administration, which is the case that we see here in Afghanistan. One involves President Clinton and the various stumbles that his administration had in 1993, 1994, beginning with Somalia, in which a UN humanitarian mission turned into a peacekeeping mission, turned into a military mission to capture the warlord Mohammed Farah Aidid. We know what happened later with the Black Hawk Down episode and the death of 18 American soldiers, scores further wounded. It was a real black eye for the administration. It certainly challenged the sense of competence that it had when the U.S. took out its forces roughly 6 months later. It also raised questions about American resolve and its willingness to stay with a fight and its credibility. This was followed October of 1993, roughly a week or so later, by the episode in Port-au-Prince in Haiti, when the USS Harlan County went in trying to offload a couple hundred U.S. troops to help restore a democratically elected president to power. Armed mobs showed up on the docks there, chanting Somalia, Somalia, and the Harlan County turned around. Things would be better months later through the intervention of President Carter and working with President Clinton on this. But essentially, it was another relatively quick black eye for the administration that once again called into question its competence in foreign policy. 8 months later, the Rwandan genocide, spring, summer of 1994. Lots of blame to go all around, to be sure, between the UN and the United States, but all were pretty slow to react, with the Clinton administration famously reluctant to use the term genocide. It's admitting that acts of genocide had happened, but that didn't go over terribly well. Once again, America's reputation, Clinton's reputation, took a hit for its failure to stand up for key principles. And there was a double standard that people perceived at work, that perhaps African lives were less precious than European lives. And that was a particularly live matter because all through this time, there were concerns about what was happening in the Balkans. And by then, in particular, what was happening in Bosnia, where the administration, first under George H.W. Bush, but then really under President Clinton, were trying to protect these enclaves of Bosnian Muslims from the predations of the Bosnian Serbs. Again, all of this emanating from the breakup of Yugoslavia and Bosnia-Herzegovina's declaration of independence in February of 1992. The international community was largely ineffective through all these years. The turnaround seems to have happened really just from the pressure of events, I would say. And here's where I want to be corrected by those who served in that administration, with an inflection point coming in July of '95 and the genocide really in Srebrenica and the killing of 7,000 Muslim men and boys. It seems to have created the need for a much more focused and purposeful response than the administration had mounted up to that time. There was also this sense that the credibility of the United States and NATO were tanking. They could no longer muddle through this crisis. And so the president himself became much more directly involved, calling for an integrated strategy that married diplomacy as well as force. Tony Lake, the national security advisor, also becomes much more involved, shifting, I would say, from a position of an honest broker to that of a policy advocate. And as a result, and not just after Srebrenica, but the bombing of the market in Sarajevo a month or so later, we get NATO airstrikes on Serb positions in August of '95, followed by the Dayton Accords in November of that year. So a real success, but finally after years of struggle. In looking at these two cases, the Clinton cases as well as Biden, and maybe any parallels between them, it is notable that both of their rebounds came in the European theater. And I don't know how much we want to make of that, or the notion that had been bandied about, certainly at the time, that perhaps there were some unspoken racial considerations involved about, again, how precious were the lives of Europeans as opposed to non-Europeans. But there were certainly strategic considerations involved, given that Europe was the primary focus and really engine of the major wars of the 20th century and of the Cold War. The Cold War originates in the center of Europe. The question of the disposition of Germany is really at the heart of it. So the European context and the implications thereof really galvanized both administrations. That's not the case when you get back to the Kennedy administration, for whom the most important, as he said, the most dangerous area of the world really was the Caribbean. And it's in 1961, April of that year, when he faces his early stumble at the Bay of Pigs. He will have lots of other travails during the year as well, but the postmortem that's done on that, I think in some ways is more consequential for his administration than the postmortems, to the extent that they took place for both Biden and Clinton, given their policy stumbles. I think I think the consequences were more overt. You see greater changes in personnel. The top folks at the CIA are cashiered within a relatively short period of time. The number two at the State Department is also sent packing. He becomes a roving international advisor. But Kennedy essentially sends those folks who were deemed either disloyal or not really team players away, and certainly those that gave him, as he felt, bad advice. And in come folks who he can trust a little bit more. Brother Bobby, who's the Attorney General, who's going to play a larger role in foreign policy. Ted Sorensen, his speechwriter. The process also becomes much more rigorous. Again, folks who've been in more recent administrations can weigh in on whether the process changes as qualitatively more recently. But it certainly seemed to change with the Kennedy administration. He becomes much more buttoned down. The paper flow is more regular. They establish a White House Situation Room to improve the level of communications coming in as well as going out, all of which leaves him better positioned for what happens in October of 1962. There are issues of credibility involved throughout. It certainly weighs on Khrushchev's mind in thinking about whether he can get away with deploying offensive capabilities in the Caribbean. He doubts that Kennedy is really up to this after Kennedy's fecklessness, as he saw it in the Bay of Pigs, his willingness to accept the construction of the Berlin Wall in August of 1961. So there's this sense that that he's empowered by Kennedy's actions. I don't want to go on too much longer. I've said probably enough, but just to sum up, it's not as clear to me that Biden's early stumbles conditioned his and Putin's actions in Ukraine as much as we saw in the Clinton case, and Kennedy's even more so as regards to Cuba. And it may not even be the case that the perception of Biden's credibility deficit contributed to Putin's invasion. There's been competing approaches on this account, recognizing that issues of credibility are often context-specific, whereas matters of resolve usually speak to individuals' stances on more substantive and long-going concerns, one's willingness to stand up for principles, one's willingness to stick with a commitment, for let's say. But with respect to Biden's credibility on Afghanistan and its impact on Ukraine, one can point to a variety of moments where the Biden administration telegraphed precisely what it was prepared to do on Ukraine and followed through, both in terms of its provision of lethal assistance as well as sanctions. And I took note of what Alex had to say previously regarding the connection between the two, and would be interested in pursuing that further as well.
So I'm keen to bring in Eric Edelman here, Eric, particularly because as we've all been meeting in the war room and talking about this for 2 years, while often giving enormous credit to the way the Biden administration has handled the war, you've largely been encouraging them to do more and not take themselves out of the fight on a number of things, not deter themselves. And yet in the last few months, we've been all watching the struggles the administration has had to get Republican support, even for what appears by that standard to be maybe not half a loaf, but 3/4 of a loaf. So I'm curious, particularly as Mark reflected on his
95% of a loaf.
There you go. As Mark reflected on some of this history, some of which we worked on together. I'm not talking about Cuba here, I'm talking about Bosnia. I'm just curious to get your take on, particularly in the lens of history, where Biden sits right now, having not gone as far as you'd like, but can't get farther than the Republican Congress will let him go.
Bill, I am not going to answer for the sins of a Republican Congress. Well, first of all, contrary to Tom, I did not find anything to correct in his presentation. I thought it was terrific and reminded me of the great reporting officer he was in Moscow when we served together on then Soviet internal politics. I am curious, and I would love to hear your thoughts about, with regard to your final comments about Putin's control being revealed in the election, with the apparent Central Electoral Commission's disqualification of Boris Nadezhdin, who is a candidate running against Putin, who nobody gave much chance of obviously beating Putin, but who did seem to generate a lot of enthusiasm because of his criticism of the special military operations. I'm curious about what you think is behind the disqualification, since obviously letting him run and still winning would, give at least some surface plausibility to, the election, as you were saying. On the question of credibility and deterrence, in the previous panel, Jim Steinberg, I don't know if Jim's still here, but Jim raised a question about whether the administration erred by, ab initio, saying we're not going to be directly involved in that, undercutting deterrence and coercion. And, Alex talked in his remarks about the failure to see the potential of a long war, which, by the way, is not just unique to the Biden administration. This is a problem that Mara and I have been wrestling with in another context, in a project we were engaged in reviewing for Congress the National Defense Strategy. And basically, for a very long time, the Department of Defense has assumed that it will only be engaged in very short wars. And we're discovering that when you get into wars of great powers, the chance of it becoming a more protracted conflict is very, very great. I think overall, because we took a holiday from having to worry about nuclear deterrence for about 30 years, we have not thought very deeply about the problem of deterrence. And we have fallen into a trap, I think, that Americans very typically fall into, which is to try and understand what deters the adversary by figuring out what would deter us, which is a enormous mistake. I mean, this is a mistake that Henry Kissinger actually pointed out in one of his lesser-known books, not his big book on nuclear strategy, but a book he wrote a few years later called The Necessity of Choice, which he wrote in early 1961, when the nation was facing for the first time the advent of intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and we were going from a period during the era of massive retaliation when policymakers had the luxury of 6 or 7 or 8 hours of warning time in case there were a Soviet attack, to 30 minutes, which powerfully concentrated people's minds. And Kissinger's observation at the time was, when it comes to deterrence, you're operating essentially in an area of uncertainty, because what matters is not what you think deters, but what the adversary thinks will deter them. And you can never absolutely know that. You can try and approximate it, you can try to understand it, but in that context, as Kissinger said, a bluff that is perceived by the adversary as serious is actually a better deterrent than a serious step that the adversary thinks is a bluff. And my criticism of the Biden administration has been that it seems to have forgotten that lesson, and rather than seeing its task as creating doubt in the mind of the adversary, it has been advertising its own doubts, which gives the adversary a giant leg up in deterring us, in my view. And by constantly describing not the things that we might do, but the things that we wouldn't do, and by the way, then frequently going ahead and doing them anyway, I think they have damaged their ability to deter, and in some sense perhaps raised the stakes, down the road when if this conflict takes a very nasty turn, if, for instance, the Congress doesn't pass the supplemental or some version of it, which, oh, by the way, will be spent largely in the United States replenishing the stocks of military equipment that we've run down, that we, the United States, need, not just for Europe, but for other contingencies as well. End of rant.
Oops, the mic, sorry about that. I would like to go back both to Eric's comments, but I'm curious, Mark, I think, anticipated that I might have a slightly different take on some of what he laid out. But also Alan and Tom's points about what I want to kind of question and push folks on is the extent to which politics plays a huge role as opposed to kind of grand theory. And whether, frankly, and one of the things I learned from President Clinton was that politics is a big factor, whether you're an oligarch or an autocrat or care about elections. And you shouldn't, negate the fact. So it's not surprising to me, Tom, right, that Putin cares where popular opinion is. And that is a factor, maybe differently than we might anticipate, but it's a factor in his decision-making. And I would say for President Clinton, I was in the second term, but in the first term, I was in Congress working as the chief counsel for Lee Hamilton on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and having to deal with endless threats to cut off funding for various things that the president wanted to do. Lee Hamilton was the chairman, and then the second 2 years of President Clinton's first term, the House was run by Republicans who were definitely feeling their oats because it was the first time they had been in charge in the House in 50 years. I will also say, though, that you talked about the difference with the Balkans. Guess who was the biggest proponent and, frankly, a constant kind of thorn in President Clinton's side and a challenge for Lee Hamilton on Bosnia and how aggressively the administration should move? Joe Biden, who was then at Senate Foreign Relations Committee, felt very strongly about U.S. engagement in the Balkans, felt that the administration was being far too timid and holding back, and had Republicans with him. Bob Dole, right, who at that point, so Dole and Biden together, and pushed various legislation. So if you look at kind of what was pushing the administration on the Balkans, it was kind of the outside context, and they had exactly the opposite problem. Their withdrawal from Somalia, they were going to lose all money. And we were trying to just hold on to streams in the House that would give the president the ability to be president. And so I would also just put that down as context for folks who are big proponents of that change should be in Congress and that Congress needs to have greater war powers authority. Congress constantly pushes presidents by controlling the purse on the decisions they make or don't make at various times. And so I think any analysis of kind of the trajectory of what leaders decide at given points should be grappling with the politics of what they're dealing with, but also with them finding their own footing. So I think part of the first term, second term, particularly when you have presidents who haven't worked internationally, is for them to recognize, and I saw it happen with President Clinton, I think President Biden has this more intuitively, that international politics and domestic politics are actually the same dynamic. You got to know how to read people and situations and understand what your adversary's challenges are politically, and be able to surround yourself frankly, rather than yes men or no, but with folks who get it on the politics, and those are the people you're going to listen to more. So I would argue that part of what happened for President Clinton, even in his first term, is he started listening to Sandy Berger more, who was the deputy, and to Tony a little less. And I think you see some of those dynamics play out in various administrations as presidents find their own footing on trying to do this stuff. So that's, I saw a thread of what you all put out, but I just wanted to pull that thread a little bit more for this.
Alex?
Thanks. I mean, this has really been a fascinating conversation and a great opportunity for me to kind of put into a historical context some of the questions that I've been wrestling with. I want to make two quick points. The first one is on Afghanistan. I think, and its relationship, in other words, to President Putin's decision-making. It's an open question why President Putin decided to invade. Ultimately, it's impossible to get into his mind and to resolve that. But I think it's important to have the timeline in front of us as we assess that. And I say that because Russia deployed tens of thousands of troops along the Ukrainian border in April, before any decision had been made about what to do in Afghanistan. Putin published his long historical essay arguing essentially that Ukraine had no independent existence, either in June or July. I don't recall which one. And if Chairman Milley is to be believed, the plans for the invasion were developed before August. So the ultimate decision may have been impacted in one way or another by a sense of resolve or credibility. But the idea of what President Putin wanted to do was in motion almost a year before. And I think that's a really important context for it. The second point, and this is sort of banal, but I think worth raising, is you defined elements of thinking about leadership, but there's another school of international relations which argues essentially leadership's actually not that important, that we should be looking at structural factors, at states as unified actors, et cetera, et cetera. And I think many people have said this, but those in government tend to reject that IR perspective and see personality as extraordinarily important and usually determinative of decision making, whereas in the academy it's sort of the other way around. And I think what's so rich about this case is this is a case where leadership clearly matters a lot. It matters, as Tom Graham has argued, Putin made decisions that another Russian leader might not have, for a whole host of reasons. And you didn't even mention his confidence in secrets, which may have led him to believe that he could pull this off without anyone knowing, which ended up being wrong. We've talked a little bit about Joe Biden, his long history of experience, his relationship with NATO leaders, his relationship and experience dealing with Putin in the first place, his upbringing in the Cold War, the way that he framed Ukraine's struggle as a struggle for democracy against authoritarianism is a Joe Biden perspective and would not have been shared necessarily by another Democratic president, to say nothing of a potential Republican president in our next election. And then you have to add in Zelensky, because in some ways he makes the argument better than the other two do. Here's a guy who was an entertainer, totally underestimated, not only by Putin, but by some in the American administration, as somebody essentially who could make people laugh, but didn't have really the interior composition to lead. And he's flipped that script entirely, taking the skills of an entertainer and turning them into leadership and communicating with the Ukrainian people in a way that a different kind of politician might not have been able to do. And you just think about him appearing 2 or 3 days ago on the front lines in a bunker under Russian assault, and there's a degree of bravery or risk acceptance there that is highly unusual. So anyway, I say this because as we assess, kind of analytically think about what's happening, I think this is an argument for leadership mattering. But it's also, as we assess leadership in our own country going forward, that decision will be an extremely weighty one for this whole problem.
I'm curious, as a question to the whole table, about the issue of fatigue. Tom and Alan, to to some degree, everybody here has talked about, not just the leaders themselves, but the people immediately around them. This has been going on for 2 years. Those of us that know Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, particularly Tony, Bill Burns, the age, 2 years have been like dog years, 14 years for them. It's been an incredibly wearing time. That must be the case in Russia. That's certainly the case in Ukraine. Maybe Yuri can tell us a little bit about that. We're seeing Zelensky now re-examining his leadership group. In China, we've seen some actually pretty extraordinary turnover in the last 2 or 3 years. It gets mentioned as a blip on the screen and then it goes away. And I'm just wondering, as several people have noticed, this has gone on much longer than was anticipated. What happens to those teams as 2 years pass, 3 years pass, 4 years pass? What can we expect to happen in these leadership teams?
Ellen may take issue with what I'm about to say, but I think, academic social science in the realm of international relations has not proven a lot of non-trivial propositions, but I think it's proven one conclusively: tired people make bad decisions. And I think all of us who've been in government have seen that up close and personal. One of the things I do worry about is the degree to which, at least, I don't worry so much about President Putin's, sleep habits, but I do worry about, whether the Biden team is running themselves ragged a little bit, and whether that will begin to really tell in this next year when they're in the midst of a presidential election, which is always a very difficult year for any administration.
Can I
Yeah, Tom?
just very quickly on this? I think we need to remember that most of Putin's close cohorts are old men. Putin himself is 71. Everybody around him that's engaged in this, well, he should be dead by Russian standards.
Average life expectancy is 57.
So, his late 60s, most in the early 70s, some of them in poor health. And they weren't expecting a long conflict at all. Now, they have taken the steps to prepare for a longer conflict. Now, they've put their economy on a war footing. They're looking at maybe 2 or 3 years into the future. Nevertheless, again, old men, tired, make poor decisions. The question of how well they actually understand the objective circumstances in which they're operating is, I think, is a big issue going forward.
Yeah, so I just had just a thought by this, and not so much about the political leaders themselves, but the military organizations that they're running. And so there's actually, again, a big literature on this that's not trivial, that looks at essentially military organizations' combat effectiveness increases actually quite dramatically over the first 90 to 180 days of combat, and then begins to just deteriorate monotonically afterwards. Now, in long wars, so if we look at World War I, 2 adaptations took place, which is a big, long European war. On the European side, they switched to a full mobilization policy where every year there would be a new cohort of young men that were being brought in that did not have the deleterious effects of having 180 days of combat. And then the United States arrived in late 1917, early 1918, that was fresh, and simply changed the tempo on the battlefield that the Germans weren't able to match in any way. What's different that's going on right now is neither Ukraine nor Russia have made this transition to an attrition-based annual mobilization process. And so the forces on both sides of the forward edge of the battle area, the front line, at this point are incredibly ground down, both in terms of their numbers, but probably more importantly, in terms of their just emotional and physical capacities. And so that it seems very unlikely that we will see the pace of operations we saw in the first 6 months of the first year. So the impact of this is on leaders trying to think through what are the options we have available for an offensive breakout, for example, that type of operation requires extraordinary physical and emotional capacity to sustain for 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks. And right now, neither side has made the military transformations that would require us to be able to see that in the coming spring.
Yuri, I want to bring in Yuri Urbanovich, who teaches in the politics department here and taught in the Russian School of Diplomacy. Yuri, you've been following not just Putin, but Zelensky, and particularly the domestic challenges that he's faced. I wonder if you could give us some thoughts about where this might go. And just for the group, we have about 8 minutes left for this session. So if you give us a few, and then we can try to come back and wrap things up.
Thank you, Bill. I actually prepared a long presentation, which I will publish. I mean,
we will be happy to publish. Give us some headlines.
Yeah, okay. Specifically speaking about Zelensky, when Zelensky came to power, he was a lovable person. You know, a former comedian, and I watched all of his, productions. He was, I mean, really very, talented actor, very talented comedian, and very popular, not only in Ukraine, but in Russia as well. He was and he made a lot of money in Russia, by the way, performing, I mean, there. But, situation, I mean, had changed, unfortunately for him. A few words about Ukraine itself. Ukraine is a very beautiful country, beautiful people, absolutely fascinating climate. I mean, in certain areas like in California, okay, people have beautiful voices, among of them are great singers, actors, writers, film directors, and so forth. When Catherine the Great, took territory, I mean, which is located on the Black Sea from the Ottoman Empire. At that time, it was all the Russian Empire. She encouraged people from Eastern Europe, particularly, to move, I mean, to what became known as New Russia, Novorossiya, okay? Many of them came from Greece, from Bulgaria, from Romania, from Hungary, from Poland, Ukrainians, many Jewish people as well, especially in Odessa. So if you look at the list of our outstanding film directors, at the Hollywood, many of them have, by the way, Odessian roots.
Eric Edelman's own ancestors.
Yes, absolutely.
Mine too.
Yeah. And I tell you, even Sylvester Stallone's babushka, or grandmother, I mean, Madame Rosenblum, I mean, she was originally from Odessa, I mean, yeah. So my point is that, many talented people, I mean, traditionally lived on the territory of this beautiful country. And one of them was Zelensky. Zelensky was from very distinguished Jewish family. His, father was a professor. I mean, his grandfather was, highly decorated, I would say, officer of the Red Army, who fought during World War II against the Nazis. I mean, and he ended up his career as a colonel. But of course, dealing with all these challenges was not easy for him, and everybody was impressed that he managed, I would say, to demonstrate, his resilience, his bravery, and his ability, to lead the country, being absolutely inexperienced in this sense. Now, on a practical note, I mean, let me emphasize what are his challenges, I mean, as of now. In December, polls, I mean, demonstrated, I have this information from Ukraine. In December, it was found that while 62% of Ukrainians said they trusted Zelensky, 88% said they trusted Zaluzhny, commander of, armed forces.
Soon to be former commander of armed forces.
Now former, I mean, former. Moreover, I tell you, as far as I know, Zelensky made a decision to appoint him ambassador of Ukraine to London. And I don't know to what extent this is trustworthy information, but nevertheless, I think it was a wise decision because, he is a real, I would say, challenge to Zelensky. And if they would have presidential elections, it looks like that Zaluzhny has more chances to win. So if, by the way, Gorbachev were, more, I would say, experienced politically, he could have appointed Yeltsin, somewhere in Ouagadougou, after he was fired, and thus, to survive. But he, so to say, allowed to stay his political opponent in Moscow, and as a result, he got into trouble, So Zelensky, let me quote, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on February the 5th submitted to his country's parliament draft laws to extend martial law and the military mobilization in the country as Russia's full-scale invasion nears the 2-year mark. Now, Zelensky's drafts provide the extension of the two measures for another 90 days from February 14th, in line with the provisions of Ukrainian constitution. This will be the 10th time since February 24th, 2022, that the Verkhovna Rada will vote on two measures. In November, Zelensky strongly hinted at a potential delay of the presidential polls, saying it would be irresponsible to hold it under wartime conditions. The two drafts were sent to lawmakers a day after Zelensky confirmed in an interview with Italian broadcaster that he is considering operating changes among Ukraine's military and political leadership amid widespread speculation that he is about to dismiss General Valery Zaluzhny, the commander-in-chief of Ukraine military. Conclusion. As it is known, on March 31st is a deadline for scheduling presidential elections in Ukraine. Of course, it raises question after that about a legitimacy of the president to execute his responsibilities after the deadline. It is a challenge to his legitimacy, unfortunately. So we'll see, how it will work, but so far it's a very challenging, two questions. On one hand, martial law. On the other hand, new law on mobilization of Ukrainian men, particularly.
Yuri, thank you.
Thank you.
I want to bring it back to our three lead speakers for a minute of closing thoughts each. We're approaching 6:15, so maybe go in reverse order and give Tom the last word here. As we think about leadership in the coming year, Mark, what are you looking for?
I'd like to see, and stepping out of my historian's role, I'd like to see President Biden be more assertive in speaking to the country, so that rhetorically he can match the presumed commitment that he has made to the defense of Ukraine with an understanding of what is needed from our own country. It's remarkable that he has spoken directly to this country in this country only twice, really. Once from the East Room, just as the invasion began, but then also in October. And in that case, it was as much about Israel as it was about Ukraine. He has certainly addressed various audiences, whether it's at a NATO summit, whether it's in Warsaw or Vilnius, but his presence has been noticeably lacking, I would say.
It's a steady theme in the war room over the last 2 years.
Yeah.
Alan?
I'm going to grab that drumstick with both hands. I think that President Biden, if there is one single thing I would point to as a tremendous flaw in his management of this war, and we've talked about the importance of the people, public perception, the support of the American people, the support of the Ukrainian people, It is extraordinary, in my own view, that President Biden has not made a dedicated national address to the American people to explain to them why this war in Ukraine and the U.S. support of the Ukrainians is so essential to American security, to security of Western Europe, to the security of all of our allies, that the entire system of Western security is built at its core around our credibility and reputation to supporting our allies and friends. And I hope that at some point in the coming year, if only being driven by the coming election in November, that he will finally make that statement.
So, Tom, this sets you up perfectly, given how much we've gotten Russia wrong. How does President Biden give that speech in a way that's not just compelling at home, but is compelling abroad, including to Russia? In 1 minute.
Yeah, I wish I knew the answer to that question. Of course, I mean, circumstances on the ground may change the context in which he has to deliver that address. I think one of the questions that we need to ask now is under what circumstances would Putin change his view as to what his goals are, whether he continues with the military operation or whether it's time to seek a negotiated settlement, thinking that he's gotten as much as he can and he needs to consolidate that in some way. I think the next several months are actually going to be critical in the way Putin thinks about this conflict going forward. Particularly because of the problems in the West in funding, because of the domestic problems we're seeing in Ukraine, the mobilization problems. He basically said, without Western support, Ukraine wouldn't last a week. He ought to be making much greater progress on the battlefield than they are at this point. So without a major breakthrough in Russia's favor on the battlefield, I think the politics inside Russia begin to shift and questions begin to be raised internally, not in public, but internally about what are we trying to achieve by throwing away thousands of lives, a massive loss of military equipment, and we're not making any progress on the ground. That's what I would look at. I think this comes late spring, early summer, and if we're lucky, President Biden gets to make the speech in a different context.
Well, thank you. I almost take that as a note of optimism. And as my colleagues at the Miller Center know, in 2024, because there is so much uncertainty, so much doubt and anxiety, my New Year's resolution was to remain persistently optimistic, stubbornly so. But one of the reasons that I'm optimistic is the great group around this table and here at the Miller Center that makes these events happen, and particularly our terrific events team, and in this case led by Christina Lopez-Guittardi-Chow, whose idea was the War Room 2 years ago, but also the great AV and events team, Alfred Reeves, our whole development team, and others that help make these things happen. And then all of you for coming, for supporting the Miller Center, for joining us online. It's the educated, engaged public that makes me optimistic about where our country's going, and I want to thank you all.